Hello, I'm Sarah Montague from The World at One.
And I'm Evan Davis from PM.
The moment Rachel Reeves was seen crying in the Commons, and it became apparent the Prime Minister wasn't going to fully back her, the bond markets became very upset too. The yield on 10-year government bonds or gilts shot up. It was the biggest jump in a day since Liz Truss was in number 10. And it's those yields which determine the interest rates that affect us all. They only came down when the Prime Minister insisted that the Chancellor would be staying. So how important is the individual to the role? Now, Evan, how do you think we should view this, the individual in the role and the effect?
Yeah. Well, it was a vote of confidence by the market in Rachel Reeves, wasn't it? Because the market seemed to be saying, if she's going, we better be charging more for interest to the UK government, which is a sort of sign that they liked her. I don't think the individual matters at all, Sarah. I think the credibility of the individual matters. And what I mean by credibility is that the Chancellor has a sufficiently robust reputation of being able to manage the public finances, that the Chancellor has something to lose by screwing it up. A Chancellor who is there and has nothing to lose by breaking their own fiscal rules, by running fiscal policy on the hoof, they're likely to buckle under pressure because they've nothing to lose.
OK, but what Chancellor doesn't have anything to lose? What I mean, you put somebody else in the job, they've got the same set of circumstances and need to keep the bond markets on side.
So I mean, you know, the people who had a lot to lose are the ones who tie themselves, chain themselves to a rule or a target. Famously, of course, the exchange rate target of the exchange rate mechanism of EMU back in the early 90s. When you were tied to that target, boy, you had a lot to lose when you failed to uphold the exchange rate target. And that gave a Chancellor a kind of credibility. And so the markets think we know where we are with this person.
OK, so this would suggest the markets like what she has said so far.
I think they like her commitment to the fiscal rules. And this ties it to the fiscal rules.
Right.
Because the fiscal rules are, if you like, the discipline on the system that says when you're having a bad day and you can't put up taxes over here and your MPs are saying you can't cut spending there and no, don't touch that or this, you can't do any of that. The temptation for a politician is to say, OK, we'll borrow more. And it's the fiscal rules that make that difficult.
We better explain what they are. What are the fiscal rules?
So the fiscal rules, they're well conceived, actually, the rules. One is that looking ahead, it's actually 2930, the year 2930, the government shouldn't be borrowing money to just cover its day-to-day expenditure. So it's kind of, we should be paying our way by 2029. We might be borrowing to invest, but we shouldn't be borrowing for, nurses' pay and just to keep the schools open. So that's the number one. That's called the current budget. And then there's a second rule which says, although we're allowed to borrow for investment, we're not allowed to borrow so much that debt is just rising inexorably. So by 2029, the measure of debt we use, the stock of debt, that should be in decline. Because as a country, you don't, at the moment the national debt is about the same as a year's worth of national income. And you kind of want it to be a bit lower than that. So there's a bit of room there for it to jump up if you have a pandemic or a war or something. So we
fix the roof while the sun is shining.
Yeah, so we probably do want to be getting that done. So the rules, they're not particularly disagreeable. There are ways in which they work that may be negative. But they targeting debt and targeting the current budget is a relatively uncontroversial.
And yet, there have been, in the last few months, an increasing number of people saying, hold on, you could look again at the rules. I mean, even the IMF was talking about making the framework and sort of easing it. And they seem to be particularly talking about whether it should be twice yearly or just once yearly. But others as well have seemed to be suggesting.
You can debate whether we've got the right fiscal rules. And whether the timing of them is right, whether they are forcing us into twice yearly tweaks to the fiscal, the taxes and borrowing, taxes and spending in order to hit them. I mean, in general, the advice is don't tinker with the fiscal rules just when you're under pressure, because that begins to look like you're using the fiscal rules, easing the fiscal rules as a way out of your headache. So I think you'd be ill-advised to say we don't care about the fiscal rules. We've seen from the bond markets yesterday that would be a risky option. And I think it might be any tweak to them right now that is not a toughening of them might be seen as just a try.
She could have done it another time, but now those fiscal rules are staying.
Well, I would have thought this is not the time to review them. But I mean, you know, never say never.
So, but she's got a problem. She's got to find some money from somewhere. And then if you're not changing the fiscal rules, you're then either cutting spending or raising taxes.
Right.
Presumably.
So let's go through the other options first.
Ooh.
Just because I want to say they're not deliverable very quickly.
Go on.
Economic growth
Okay.
is a way out. And that is why the government keeps saying we want growth, we want growth, we want growth. That would be very helpful. But growth, measures government pursue to get growth normally deliver small amounts over long periods of time. So all their planning reforms have been scored as making a difference to growth. In fact, virtually nothing has ever been scored as making as big a difference to growth. The numbers are still tiny and it takes 10 years. So there's growth. The other thing you might say you want to do, which is what every politician always says they want to do, is efficiency improvements in the public sector so we can cut spending without anybody noticing.
More bang for our buck.
Yeah. I think underplayed this year has been the most interesting experiment in government efficiency in the United States, where they brought in a guy with a lot of experience of delivering efficiencies very quickly, called Elon Musk, gave him a department to find efficiencies in American government. And to be absolutely honest, Sarah, I think most of the evidence is they've done absolutely nothing. They've been quoting very big numbers, but a lot of it is just cuts, not efficiency. And most of the things they've talked about have turned out not to have as much behind them as stated. So I think Doge tells you it's harder than you think. And, you know, you'll hear people in the pub saying, I could get 5%, 10% out of government spending and no one would notice. And I think Doge has put that kind of, there are easy efficiencies to bed for the while. Don't rely on that.
Okay, well, remember, we're going to be watching reform in local councils to see if they can do it, because that's their problem.
And we'll see if they can do it. And they'll cut, a few people in the DEI departments or whatever. But whether that's going to pay for social care is a really, really big question. So then you are back to these two basic decisions. Are we going to raise taxes or are we going to cut the plans we have for government spending?
And given the political considerations, it's tax, isn't it?
Look, you might find things on spending. You could name things that you could cut on spending, like you could cut winter fuel allowance for better off pensioners. But every time you take these decisions, the people who are all in favour of lower taxes and cutting spending say, yes, cut spending, but not there. And so it is not easy to find big cuts in public spending.
So
then you're back to taxes, and then you're back to the credibility of the Chancellor having made promises on taxes as to whether you break those promises with the obvious... essentially, she's bind herself in because she said no increases in the basic taxes, VAT, national insurance and income tax.
And she said no increase in taxes on working people. But we have had the national insurance rise
on businesses,
on employees, on the employer side of things. Are there other things that she can do that she could present as no increase in taxes? For example, freezing the tax thresholds.
Well, that is just an increase in tax, and we're already freezing the tax thresholds for several years. We're relying on doing that to get money in as it is. So I'm not that convinced that route's going to raise a lot. But that is an increase in income tax anyway. I mean, if you freeze the thresholds, you're just collecting more income tax. I think broadly speaking, there are areas you could raise tax. One thinks of council tax, for example. Our taxes on housing are not internationally very high. They're much better off. The much more expensive houses don't proportionally pay as much council tax. You could do a whole lot of stuff there.
Mansion tax, basically.
Good luck with that, because that is not a popular area for tax, because people don't like taxes, which come in the form of an annual bill, and whether or not you've got the money, you have to pay it. People prefer taxes, in general, like income taxes and VATs, that are levied as you spend or earn. So you always got the money to pay income tax because it's sliced out of the income you're already getting. But so I think council tax is right for looking at, but it's not.
Okay, so
not going to be easy.
If she is going to sort of go against one of the things, whether it's in the manifesto or the fiscal rules, from what you're suggesting, perhaps the most sensible thing to do is just to move on income tax.
Well, I think a lot of economists would say this is the basic tax, and we've been trying to hold it down as the welfare state has become bigger. And essentially, it seems very difficult to raise substantial amounts without going after basic taxes on income or spending. I would say you could do what the last government did. Now, this is a forgotten episode in Britain's tax history, but the last Conservative government did have a promise not to raise these taxes, very similar to Labour's. And then they did vote to introduce a thing called the Health and Social Care Levy, which was a new tax. And so you could engage in a much bigger tax reform. You could say the world has changed. We need money for defence. We need money for the welfare state. We need money, Sarah, by the way, to cover the fact we're losing our petrol tax revenue as people switch to electric cars.
You're always
There's a whole
going
lot
on about
I
that
know.
one.
I mean, it's 20 billion and it's looming.
That's the Evan tax.
Yeah. You could say we're going to have a big tax reform and going to rebadge and rename some taxes, so we're not strictly breaking our promises.
Can I just raise one other idea, which is that, I mean, clearly the Chancellor was upset yesterday. We have no idea why, and they say it was a private matter. It's not inconceivable that she could resign. She could say, look, yes, in different circumstances I might like to carry on, and I know you want me to carry on, but I don't want to do it anymore. Now, does that have the same effect on the market?
I think it would depend on who the replacement is and the circumstances in which she went. I think if it looked like the pressure had got to her because she was not able, among her cabinet colleagues and backbench MPs, to deliver the promises she'd made, and she's like, this is impossible.
You've left me nowhere to go.
Yeah. Then I think that would be quite concerning. If it was, I'm having a hard time at home and I need a break and more time with my family.
And then you put somebody like Pat McFadden or
someone who
Wes
says,
Streeting.
First thing they say is, this is not about
we're not changing the fiscal rules.
This is not
those
your
fiscal rules.
It's not your get out of jail card. Then I think the markets would take that fine.
Okay.